The people of the South Seas must be ranked as among the most brave, the most skillful of all the sailors of the world. In their canoes, they sailed over hundreds of miles of the Pacific, colonizing small coral islands and spreading as far as New Zealand, 1,000 miles to the south. And when the first European travelers went to the South Pacific, they were very impressed by the craft that they saw. This is a drawing by Captain Cook's artist, which was made in Tonga at the end of the 18th century. And it shows what is perhaps the finest and most impressive and most efficient of all the ocean-going canoes. This is a Ndrua, a twin canoe, as it's called in Fijian, a double canoe. And it's called a twin or double canoe because it has two twin hulls, each of them virtually a separate dugout. They were over 100 feet long. They could carry over 200 men. One is recorded as carrying 12 live cows in the hold alone, as well as several tons of food on the big deck. They had gigantic steering paddles in the stern, and in heavy seas, handling those paddles required several men. And often those men wrestling with these paddles in high seas strained themselves so badly that they became crippled for life and sometimes died on the voyage. And these boats could do speeds of up to 10 or 12 knots. That is to say, they could possibly overtake a European merchant ship sailing in those waters. And that was a very serious business, because 150 years ago, the inhabitants of Fiji were cannibals. And if you were a merchant sailor, well, and you were caught by one of these canoes, there was very little doubt as to what would happen to you. But the European sailors learned a technique for escaping from these huge war canoes. They sailed directly into the wind with the wind filling their sails, and when that happened and the Ndrua tried to follow, the wind filled this huge sail with such force that it forced the bows down and the thing sank. But it would have been a very wonderful thing indeed to see a canoe like that. But when I went to Fiji and asked about the Ndrua, they said, oh, all those are finished. Their last one rotted away perhaps 50 years ago. Now the big ocean-going vessels are made on the European pattern. But they said, why not go to Canberra? Because Canberra is the place where they were all made. And they were all made in Canberra because Canberra is one of the few islands in this part of the Pacific that has forests of vesi trees. And vesi timber was the best timber, and the timber used for the big dugout canoes. They said you won't see a dugout canoe, but you won't see a double canoe, but you may see a dugout canoe, you may see carver bowls, and anyway, they said, you'll get a very good idea of what life is like in one of these outlying islands of Fiji. So that's what we did. In a schooner, we sailed away to this island of craftsmen, the island of Canberra. Canberra's forests of vesi trees cover most of the central part of the island and run right down to the sea. The beaches are so blindingly white that when you walk along them, you simply can't open your eyes wide without very real pain. These women, squatting on the beach in the fierce tropical sun, were preparing to go fishing in the lagoon, and they're blackening their faces with charcoal as a protection against the glare reflected from the coral sand and the surface of the sea. In their baskets, they have some hermit crabs, which they've collected to use as bait. I watched them go with interest because I wanted to see what kind of canoe they would use. After all, Canberra, famous for centuries for its fine canoes, might be expected still to produce something a little special. But in fact, this was a perfectly ordinary outrigger, similar to the ones that you can see over vast areas of the Pacific. Their first job was to find the best spot for fishing among the towers of coral that rose up from the white, sandy bottom of the lagoon. The tops of the towers, flattened by the waves, are only a few feet from the surface and make excellent platforms on which to stand while you bait your hooks and sort out the lines. The Fijians have used goggles like these for many years. They're made from tiny pieces of glass and fit very close to the eyes. Using them underwater not only enables you to see a shark if it comes your way, but it also makes it possible for you to select exactly which fish you will catch among all those that swim 20 feet below you in the crystal waters. Usually, all you have to do is to dangle your bait in front of the fish that you've selected. It bites and up it comes, though sometimes not quite all the way. But when you have caught one, you kill it by biting it at the back of its neck, and then you store it in the coconut leaf basket at your waist, which holds the bait. In a few hours, you can catch a basket full of fish of the most brilliant colors, sufficient to provide an excellent meal for all your family. Farther along this lovely mile-long beach, you come to Tokelau, the main village of the island. This is the home of the Carpenter clan, the children of Lamanki as they're called, who are famous not only for their canoes, but for their tanoa, their carver bowls, which this man is making. Every household in Fiji and in Tonga has to have its carver bowl, just as every British household has to have a teapot. Some even have 3 or 4, and most societies or clubs or institutions have a special large carver bowl used for important ceremonies. And nearly all these bowls come from this one island and are made by craftsmen like this man. Most of his techniques are the old traditional ones. He still uses an adze, though its blade, which 150 years ago would have been of stone, is now made of steel. But the shape of the tool and the way of using it is still the same. One tool which hasn't changed is this pig's tusk, which is used for the final polishing. This finished bowl may be traded from island to island and eventually find its permanent home in Tonga, 200 miles to the east, or in the Yasawa Islands, 300 miles to the west. The carver bowl maker had told me that some relative of his was at work on a dugout canoe down at the far end of the village, and I decided to go along and see how he was getting on. The canoe makers were working in the shade of a grove of coconut palms. Some of these people almost certainly have Tongan blood in their veins, for the gigantic double canoes of the past took several years to build, and many of the Tongans who sailed here to make war canoes for themselves came to like the island so much that eventually they stayed here for good. Even a small single dugout like the one this man is making could take several months to build. Merely out of curiosity, I asked the head canoe maker whether he himself had ever worked on one of the old-style double canoes. Like this one, I said, but with 2 hulls, Ndrua, the twin canoe. Oh, yes, he said, I've made one. I was sure I hadn't understood him correctly. You made one yourself? Oh, yes, he said. It's over there on the beach. To be absolutely honest, I thought that this was yet another of those very frequent occasions on which I had failed to make myself understood to a Fijian, that we were at cross purposes, and that he was going to show me just a rather large outrigger canoe. But I went along with him just in case, and there it was, high above the waterline, a genuine double canoe with two twin hulls, maybe a little smaller than the ones that had been seen by Captain Cook and the other early travelers, but nonetheless a genuine double canoe built on exactly the same principles. But was it still seaworthy? Had he got the masts and the tackle and the sail somewhere? He seemed a little doubtful, for he said he hadn't taken the canoe to sea for a very long time. But he'd go and have a look. And somewhere or other, he had found them. The canoe had no metal fittings at all. The pivots, the cleats, and the bollards were all carved from solid Vesi wood. The oars of the ancient double canoes were gigantic things, over 30 feet long, and even the two that were produced for this smaller version were impressively large. The sail, made of woven pandanus mats sewn together, was rather tattered and had to be tied to the booms with string made from plaited coconut fiber. By now, lots of the villagers had gathered round, for this was quite an event to get the old canoe seaworthy again. And now came the moment of launching. We needed the help of everybody available to shove the very heavy canoe down the beach to the lagoon. And so, at last, we started on our little voyage. To begin with, the huge sail had to be hoisted. As soon as it was fully up and the wind filled it, then the canoe got underway, and we set off across the lagoon at a really spanking pace. I reckon we must have been doing at least 6 or 7 knots. In order to get out of the lagoon, we had to make for the one and only passage through the surrounding reef. And to do this, we had to tack. We couldn't swing the boom and change direction as you do in a European-style yacht. Instead, the whole sail has to be carried from one end of the canoe to the other, so that the stern now becomes the bows, and the ship goes in the opposite direction. It was easy to see that this must be an extremely tricky operation in any wind stronger than the gentle breeze. Soon, we were through the reef and heading for the open sea. It was quite a calm day, the sea an unbelievably bright blue. But once we were outside the protection of the reef, there was quite a swell, and we began to ship water over the bows. What's more, the hulls of the canoe, not having been at sea for some time, leaked a little, and we had to start bailing. As we sailed away from Canberra, farther out to sea, I began to get some small idea of the tremendous toughness, bravery, and skill of the sailors of the South Seas, who in times gone by had sailed craft like this, not for a few miles in calm waters, but for several hundreds of miles through high seas and hurricanes, right across the Pacific to settle in some tiny, uninhabited coral island. When we in fact had gone a mile or two beyond the reef, we turned back and went to Canberra, but ships like that often sailed on for 100 miles or so because they sailed on to Tonga. There was a constant sailing between Canberra and Tongan. Often the Tongans would come this way in their rather crude dugout canoes and persuade the Canberra people to build them new, smart Fijian Ndrua, and they would live with the Canberra people for several years, paying for their canoe, their new canoe, by in fact fighting for the Canberra peoples in the tribal wars. And then, when they'd paid their debt, they took their brand new, smart Fijian double canoe and sailed back to Tonga. And that's just what we did after leaving Canberra, not actually in a double canoe, but in a schooner. And we went to Tonga to look for new people, but when eventually we landed there, we became fascinated, first of all, by the animals, which frankly I had not expected to find in such numbers in this isolated speck of land in the South Pacific. The palace in Tonga is the home not only of Queen Salote, but of someone who's almost as famous, Tui Malila, and this is him. Tui Malila is almost certainly the oldest living creature in the world. In his time, he survived some pretty serious accidents, as the dents and holes in his shell prove. Once he was kicked and his shell cracked by a horse. On another occasion, he was severely burnt during a forest fire. But still he plods sedately around the palace. He must now be at least 190 years old, and he's probably over 200, for he was presented to one of Queen Salote's ancestors by Captain Cook during the explorer's visit to the island in either 1773 or 1777. And Tui Malila must have been quite a sizable tortoise even then. His favorite food is pawpaw, but unfortunately he's now completely blind, and unless someone is there to help him, his bites sometimes miss the food. So it is that a palace servant is given the special responsibility of making sure that this aged Tongan, who has been given the honorary title of Tui, or chief, gets all the food he needs and doesn't stray too far. But of course, Tui Malila, although he's lived in Tonga for over 180 years, is not a true-born Tongan. Indeed, there are very few animals native to this island. One of them, however, is a truly terrifying-looking creature. This is a robber, or coconut crab. From claw to claw, it's over 2 feet across, and watching it, you're reminded not of an animal, but of some ghastly, inanimate mechanical robot. Another crab was crouching in the hole at the base of the tree. At first, I thought that this grasp was some sort of greeting, but in fact, it was soon quite clear that the crabs were engaged in a silent, inhuman fight. For the pincers, having met, were crunching one upon the other, and with a horrid splintering sound, the small pieces of limish shell were chipping off and flying into the air. The crabs were in battle, but it wasn't a battle of lunge and thrust, of skillful parries and circling for position. It was a steady, remorseless, trial of strength, each crab straining every muscle, both trying to withdraw, yet both seemingly unable to let go of one another. This senseless, ferocious tug-of-war continued for nearly a quarter of an hour, the gigantic claws locked together. Neither, it seemed, could win, and neither would surrender. And then, quite unexpectedly, one of them turned away. They had separated. This one retreated towards his hole in the roots of the tree. The other, the one that had fallen, began climbing once more, this time up the trunk of a coconut palm. I had never seen these creatures before, and after watching the battle, I thought I would like to examine one of them a little more closely. The scar on its claw had been inflicted during the fight, and it was clear evidence that a nip from one of these pincers would be very unpleasant indeed. These crabs are such powerful creatures that they can strip the husk from a coconut, split the shell to eat the flesh inside. And they will do this to ripe coconuts that have fallen to the ground, and even climb up the palm trees to cut down the nuts for themselves. Indeed, they can be serious pests in coconut plantations, but they rarely become common, for they make very good eating and are eagerly hunted by the islanders for food. They have developed a special mechanism which enables them, once they've passed their larval state, to spend the rest of their life out of water. This one was bright blue, flushed with pink. Some crabs, like the little hermit crab to which this one is related, can, I think, be rather endearing, charming creatures. But I found it a little difficult to regard this huge robber crab in the same sort of way. In the center of the island, in a grove of casuarina trees, lives a colony of quite different creatures. Flying foxes, or to give them their more accurate name, fruit bats. They are among the largest bats in the world, with a wingspan of over 4 feet, and they live entirely on fruit. Mangoes are their particular favorite. They feed during the night, and during the daytime, they roost in these noisy colonies. They have a peculiar, strong, musty smell, but the Tongans say that they make very good eating as long as you don't let the fur touch the meat before you cook it. But this particular colony is sacred, taboo. According to legend, a Tongan named Ula sailed over to Samoa to take part in the canoe races. He was very successful, and the daughter of one of the Samoan chiefs fell in love with him. When he left, she gave him a single, pure white fruit bat. He took it back with him in his canoe to Tonga, and it lived happily in his village. Soon it gave birth to young, and in a few years there was a large colony. One day, Ula went to visit the chief of the village of Kolovai, and the chief asked him to give him the bats. Well, according to Tongan custom, it's not possible for anyone to refuse a request from a chief. So Ula gave the bats to the chief, and they've lived here in the center of the village of Kolovai ever since. The single white bat, however, that had been given to Ula in Samoa, he took back to his own village. It's said that this white bat sometimes reappears here in Colivai. And when it does, it's a sign that a member of the royal family or the chief of Colivai is about to die, and the bat will stay until the funeral is over. Happily, however, as far as I could see, there wasn't a single white bat among them. They were all chocolate brown with honey-colored heads. Anyway, the bats are still sacred, and no one except the royal family are allowed to shoot them. Because no one interferes with these sacred bats, they're very tame, and they roost much lower than any other fruit bats that I'd ever seen. And as a result, I had the chance of observing them much more closely than I'd ever been able to do before. I was able to see, for example, the precise way in which a mother carries her half-grown youngster, and see how even at this late stage, she takes the responsibility of cleaning his wings. She even makes sure that his ears aren't dirty. Bats seem to have got a reputation for being dirty and flea-ridden, but on this evidence at least, it would seem that they keep themselves meticulously clean. I was also able to observe exactly how a young bat lazily completes his toilet in the early morning sun. When he's finished cleaning himself, sometimes he'll hang not by his feet, as these are doing, but by the long thumbs on his wings, his feet hanging free. But all isn't amiability in the colony. Fruit bats are really rather quarrelsome creatures, and often the loser of a quarrel will have to escape by taking to flight. And here again, the opportunities for observation were better than I'd ever had before. For as the bats came flapping low over our heads, they showed us perfectly the structure of the bones as the sun shone through their parchment wings. And I was able to see exactly how they alighted in the trees. They don't all use the same method. This one hooks on and falls backwards. This one grips first with his mouth and then with his thumb. And this one, using perhaps the commonest method of all, just latches on with his feet and flops over forwards. But we had, after all, gone to Tonga to film people, and in particular, the most ancient and sacred ceremony of Tonga, the royal carver ceremony, in which the Queen herself takes part. It's a ceremony which very few Europeans have been allowed to see and has never been filmed before. But exactly what it was like, I'll tell you about next time.